Hello everyone, welcome to Recitals in Depth, where we will analyze all the important articles from the entire month across multiple dimensions. In here, we'll be covering science and technology section from the month of July. We'll be covering some important topics like what is the India-Australia space collaboration, what is AI washing, as a new star is going to be exploded soon. What is the process of birth and death of stars? What are transposons? What is dark oxygen? And the other aspects of biotechnology, space science, and general science. For a better learning experience, you can also download the Recitals magazine from our website. So, let's begin our discussion. So now, before beginning the discussion, a very important reminder. When you approach the current affair which is a very integral part of the examination, it should not be handpicked or it should not be handled in silos from the static knowledge. Integration of both the current and static becomes very, very important. And with that intention, we have brought forward the recitals discussion. In today's discussion, from the July's monthly magazine, these are the following topics which we are going to cover. Among them also, some of them are very important for both prelims and mains examination. Some of them are showcasing how we are collaborating with other nations, for example, Australia. And going forward, we will see how we are collaborating with NASA, ESA, JAXA, etc. So those space collaborations which are very important in space diplomacy that we are going to read. So the first important topic is space metry. Then as you must have already heard about whitewashing, greenwashing, now a new word has come up. This is AI washing. This can be asked in both prelims and mains. How in prelims? Recently seen in news, AI washing refers to which of the following, and the statements will be given to you. So conceptual understanding of AI washing is very important, especially as we are entering the Industrial Revolution 4.0. Next one is, what are supercapacitors? What is capacitance? How is it measured? How can we create eco-friendly capacitors? What are its significance and why is it beneficial for India specifically? So we are going to read that. The next one is a star which is undergoing nova explosion. So what are the different types of stars? What is the process of nuclear stellar synthesis, or also known as stellar nucleosynthesis? So we are going to read that in this particular topic. We are also going to read about hologram technology. We are going to read about the junk DNAs which were not appreciated before, but now it is gaining the limelight because of the application found in gene editing. So we'll be reading about transposons. We'll be reading about Axiom, again a space integration between ISRO and NASA. And then we'll be reading about other things, but uranium contamination, nova, tinzapirin, what is dark oxygen, ketamines. These are again some of the important topics which we shall be reading in great detail in this discussion. So I welcome you all to attend the discussion. So coming to the first topic. First topic is, what is space metry? So as the name suggests that it is a kind of collaboration, a friendly effort between two countries. These two countries are India and Australia, which are endeavoring to make space collaboration. Here, Australia, which is deemed to be a developed country, is not going to help India. In fact, India is going to lend its help to Australia. How? Let's understand about what are the features about the mission. So here what is going to happen? The largest, mind you, the largest spacecraft created by Australia with the name of Optimus will be carried to space with the help of services from India. So from India, the small satellite launching vehicle, mind you, we are not even taking the help of PSLV and GSLVs, which are better and more heavy lifters. Our SSLV will be enough to carry 450 kgs, which is the largest spacecrafted satellite created by Australia. So this is the collaboration under space metry. Also, to help you with the prelims preparation, if it comes to you that is a particular keyword, if you have to guess whether this belongs to or what does it signify, if it has words like TIR or if it has words like TRI, then definitely one of the meaning could be technology, research and innovation, which could be used and arranged interchangeably. So it makes the guesswork more easy. So this of course again is a research, technological and innovation project. Okay, so this is clearly about the space technology, where India is going to lend its help in lifting a satellite, placing a satellite of Australia into the space. Okay, why should Australia choose India as a partner and not NASA, not China, not Roscosmos? The reason is, first of all, India is a friendly partner. India is a reliable, trusted space partner. Secondly, India is very efficient and also not just energy efficient, but also cost efficient when it comes to satellite launching. So among all the competitors, India offers in fact its most basic launching vehicle is able to lift Australia's most largest spacecraft. So the cost efficiency that is brought forward by India is maximum, not just for Australia, but also for maximum countries of the Africa and the Middle East. So when they also endeavor into space, they look into the services provided by India. This is known as a country's space diplomacy. What is space diplomacy? What are the challenges, advantages with India? We shall be reading it in great detail. But before that, let's understand some of the other basics. What is the objective of Space Maitri? So first of all is to forge a stronger collaboration between the two partner nations. So first of all is to strengthen the India and Australia relations. India and Australia, who have been historic partners, and they have been creating partnership on multiple fronts, from climate change to making more carbon efficient solutions, energy efficient solutions. So we have created partnership on environmental friendly solutions, so on climate friendliness. So basically first area of collaboration is climate change. For that, to create better energy efficient options, both of them are collaborating on an over international solar alliance, which is led by which country? India or Australia? You try to answer that in comment section. It's a very important alliance. The second in which we are creating partnership is over Indo-Pacific region. So both of them are partners to many Indo-Pacific cooperation alliances or Indo-Pacific economic alliances. The third area of participation is of course trade. Trade ties are very important between both of them. For example, the trade of milk, for example, the trade of horticulture, trade of food grains from India to Australia is an also important aspect of export for India. And now we have got space in which we are collaborating together. So this is going to enhance our diplomacy, right or not? And the second objective is to do something which is in alignment to both of our core values, which is to create sustainable space exploration. How to create that? First of all, we need to counter the basic menace which is against the sustainability, that is creation of space debris, which I have already taught you in the previous part of recitals. So here, to counter space debris is again there another effort. So the objective over here is to not only forge important diplomatic ties, but also to lessen the space debris. Okay, and space debris gets lessened when instead of creating all the products by your own country from your own side, you try to collaborate so that large amount of generation of space-based product doesn't happen, and only things which are efficient, only things which are really important for a nation, safety, security, vigilance, etc., only those are deployed, or let's say for forecast, only those are deployed into space, but of course with the help of collaboration. So this is how we are able to reuse and recycle already existing products, for example these launching vehicles. This is also a very cost efficient solution, especially for countries like Australia. Okay, you've understood the objective. Now, who is going to launch this? Is it ISRO? Not exactly. This is in fact NSIL, New Space India Limited. So what is New Space India Limited? Let's have a look. Now you tell me, if a country comes to ISRO and asks, ISRO please create this particular product for me, will ISRO create it? No. But in order to avail those services, ISRO has its own commercial arms. Name of commercial arm of ISRO is known as Antrix. Name of commercial arm of ISRO is known as Antrix. Okay, and there is another commercial arm which is with the Department of Space. This is not under ISRO, it is collaborated by ISRO, but it is under Department of Space, and this is known as NSIL, New Space India Limited. So what is this? This is a commercial arm under whom? Department of Space. It was launched in 2019. And what is the objective of this? The objective of this is not just to create the space-based products for India, not just for India, but also the products or the services which we can lend or export to other nations. So in order to commercialize our space innovations, NSIL was created in 2019 under Department of Space. Okay, so we have understood this, but how is it different from Antrix, or how is it different from other branches of ISRO? The answer to this is demand driven organization. What do we mean by demand driven? So when it comes to ISRO makes the announcement that we are going to launch Chandrayaan, or we are going to launch the next version of Chandrayaan, or Mangalyaan, or soon to come the Shukrayaan. So all of them are supply driven. Nobody is demanding ISRO. None kind of demand is coming to the ISRO. But in the case of NSIL, the countries are demanding from India to create cost-efficient products for them, safe products for them, energy-efficient products for them. And for that, NSIL has become demand-driven. So if my country has certain demands, certain operational demands with respect to creation of satellite, it creates satellites. Please understand the functions of NSIL. This is very important. Second is launching vehicles. In the launching vehicles, it will only be creating SSLV, giving the services of SSLV and the Polar Satellite Launching Vehicle. So which services is not providing? It is not providing the service of GSLV, which is only under ISRO. So please remember, it doesn't do very heavy lifting. It only manages its function with the help of these two service providers or launching vehicle. Okay, so it creates satellites, it creates launching vehicle, it also renders the service of existing satellite and launching vehicle, and then it also provides other services as well. For example, launching services, for example, rescuing services. So all of this will also be undertaken by NSIL. So I hope the mantra of NSIL is clear to you. Now one more important thing. What is the ISRO's organizational structure and how does it look like? Headquartered in Bangalore. NSIL is also headquartered in Bangalore. So first of all, the entire structure is headed by PMO, headed by Prime Minister. Then comes the Department of Space, and under the Department of Space we have got Antrix and we have got NSIL. Okay, Antrix was initially the direct part of ISRO, and now it is also managed by Department of Space. Both of them are public sector undertaking. I have already told you these are the commercial arms. They have been registered under the Companies Act. Okay, so what are they? They are basically PSUs. The second is IN-SPACe. Now IN-SPACe is also to boost the space efforts from India's side. But what is the difference between NSIL and IN-SPACe? NSIL directly provides the services to the other countries or to our own country if they want any kind of space-based demand. Okay, but if let's say some other company of India wants to collaborate with ISRO or Department of Space to create new space product, then where to register for that collaboration? There has to be an authorization center for it, right? That authorization center is IN-SPACe. So IN-SPACe is to call in the private sector participation. This is for calling out the private sector participation, giving them a platform to register themselves, to authorize themselves so that they can also create space-based product. Okay, so this is authorization sector again under Department of Space. Okay, then there is ISRO. There are multiple center units, control units based in Bangalore, Bhopal, Hassan of Karnataka, and there is ISRO Council, which is primary body responsible for creating or making all the decisions. So the hierarchy goes like this. Okay, the accountability hierarchy. The reporting hierarchy goes like this, in this direction. Okay. Now the second point is, what is space diplomacy and how does it help us to manage our international relations and also how to further our national interest with the help of collaboration and cooperation. First of all, what is space diplomacy? So space diplomacy is the use of space which is the rising area of collaboration and competition, can also be used as a very meaningful resource among various nations for integrating their international relations in order to further up their own individual interest and also to move towards a practice of sustainability of the use of this global common good, which is space. So this is space diplomacy. Okay. The space diplomacy, because it is rising, the space frenzy is rising. We have already read about multiple challenges associated with space frenzy. For example, creation of space debris, for example, threatening each other's satellite, etc. So all of these have to be taken into account into space diplomacy. What is space diplomacy? We have read. What is the significance of space diplomacy? Why is it important? First and foremost, it enhances the negotiation power of the country which is rendering its space services, or more so to say it in a better way, which is having more stronger foothold in providing high technological and efficient space services. Let us have an example. Russia and NASA, Roscosmos and NASA were among the forerunners of the space technology back then. So they lended their capabilities, their launching vehicles, in order to put up a lot of nation satellite into orbit. One such country was India also. So what happened? India's first, let's have a look into India and Russia space diplomacy first. So as an example of enlarging negotiation power, we can see how Russia helped India to launch its first spacecraft in the space. The launching vehicle was not of India but of Russia, and in return it negotiated for using one of the very important ports of India for carrying out its import and export seamlessly without any duties. So obviously the bargaining power of Russia has changed, because for India nobody could help at that time better than Russia. So definitely India would be willing to provide services in return. So it enhances the negotiation power. Second example could be seen in the case of next giant, which is USA. So USA has got not just NASA but also has Tesla, SpaceX. So with the help of those public and private participation, it was able to leverage its space tech to next level. So it obviously helped a lot many countries. In fact, almost all the countries of the world, nearly 60% of those who are involved in space endeavors have got their services or collaboration in one form or the other with the help of or through NASA. Okay, so NASA, or basically USA, it rendered its space services which enhance its negotiation in many areas. First example is military alliance, especially among the NATO members and also non-NATO members. For example, many other European states and the Middle East states. The second negotiation power it leveraged was in the form of trade negotiations. So if I'm lending my service to some country which could potentially provide me good amount of agriculture commodity at cheaper prices, the country would be forced to do that under this negotiating power of USA, because it is helping it to provide space efficient solutions, right? So how it enhances? It is not only helping it in military alliances, but also in trade settlements, also helping it to enhance its bargaining power in many kind of trades. So bargaining power enhances. Access to infra, especially to the space infra of that particular country, that they are also getting access to data, space related data of the country. So this is how the negotiation power increases. The second one is, space is a collective common. Space belongs to everyone, it's a global common. Anything which has a global common poses with us global challenges, which will be having repercussions on everyone, each and every country alike, right? In order to deal with these global challenges, there needs to be a global cooperation. How can global cooperation see the light of the day? With the help of international diplomacy on space, right? So collective common has led to many international collaborations. For example, the International Space Station. Do you know it is not managed by one or two countries? It is managed by multiple countries. In fact, the 5 most prominent countries, JAXA, Roscosmos, ESA, the Canada one, the NASA, they all come together to manage the ISS. This is what? This is a global cooperation. This is a form of international space diplomacy. Not only that, for the peaceful use of space, there is also one more treaty which is known as Outer Space Treaty. It was signed. Second is the Outer Space Treaty. So this one was signed in the year 1967, and this calls for deferment of the use or prohibition for the use of any militarization activities or nuclear weapons in the space. Okay, so it prohibits all the countries party to it. Second thing is collective exploration of the space resources. We have got one particular mission over here worth mentioning. This is the mission Artemis. Artemis is a global collaboration between many countries to collaborate on the exploration for Moon and Mars, but more importantly, Moon. So these are the areas of collective collaboration. Why? Because space is a collective common. Third significance is it helps us to explore and coexist collectively. When we are together working on ISS, when we are together working on, let's say, missions like Artemis, or when we are adhering to the rules of Outer Space Treaty, what are we doing? We are calling for sustainable and equitable distribution of all the space products that have been discovered by us. So all the research outcomes, all the space product outcomes that any particular countries has obtained, let's say discovery of a particular element, discovery of water on any moon or on any planet, that information has to be shared among all of us. So this calls for exploring and coexisting collectively. So if we are able to explore and coexist collectively over the space, the distribution of its benefit could be equitably spread to all of the humankind, right? Then if these are the significances, of course, there are certain associated challenges as well. So what are the challenges of exploring space and having these global collaborations? So the challenge is not actually with the global collaboration as such, but the challenges that we face is because of the space frenzy. So talking about the first challenge is the rising space rivalry. What has led to rising space rivalry? Because the known space resources are still limited. In the previous lecture, we have already learned about what is geostationary orbit, what is low Earth orbit, what are polar orbits, and which are the most reliable orbits for some particular kind of missions. So therefore, we have limited orbits. We have limited Lagrange's point also, the points of equilibrium between two gravitational bodies. Now, when all of these countries are together trying to enter into these resources, for example, the moon, the other asteroids, for example, these orbits, of course, there will be rise in competition for the orbits, competition from the potential resources that could be present over there, competition on whether this particular resource has been picked or has been first recognized by country A or by country B. So the competition of recognition is also there. So a lot of frenzy is there. Competition of resources, especially the mineral resources. Mineral resources, for example, helium, for example, hydrogen, for example, oxygen primarily, for example, water, some of the critical rare minerals, right? So these competition for, of course, orbits, competition for recognition. Who has done it first? So it has enhanced the space rivalry with the rising competition, with the rising participation. The second one is weaponization of the space. Weaponization of the space. Now what happens is, there is another technology which is coming up front. This is the anti-satellite missile technology. What happens is, we already know that the problem of defunct satellites are there in the space. Many satellites which have already run out of their lifespan are still there in the space, and either they needs to be brought in back to the earth. For example, we read the Lignosat in the last month's recital, or we can destroy it in the space. The problem with destroying them in the space is that it will create space debris, and it will further cascade into multiple other debris. So it will create what we already have learned as the Kessler syndrome. But more than that, this technology, because it is using missile, therefore it can also lead to weaponization of the space. Let's say if country A has accidentally, mind you the word, has accidentally destroyed the satellite, the functional satellite of country B, then country B would consider it as a war or a kind of attack on its sovereignty, a kind of attack on its technological innovation. So therefore country B would retaliate by again putting anti-satellite missile technology against A's satellite, and this will lead to weaponization of the space. This will not only create the space debris in the space in and around the orbit of the earth, but will also torment the international relations on the earth between these two countries. So this is again second challenge. Now the third challenge, as I've already told you, is the rising space debris. So what happens is, many countries, what they do in order to basically destroy their defunct satellites, they've been using the anti-satellite missile technology. Now mind you, so they've been using it with the declared agenda of destroying their own defunct satellite, but it is actually a kind of attack in disguise, a kind of test on future missile attacks or future space weaponization, if at all it can happen. So it is a kind of demo tests which are happening, and this has not been just conducted by other countries but also by India. So what was the name of the mission? It was conducted by DRDO, and name of the mission was Mission Shakti. All of them are using what? Anti-missile technology, anti-satellite missile technology, right? So what happens is, first of all, it attacks, it tries to break the satellite, but it also creates environmental menace, which is the space debris. So rising space debris is also a problem. In fact, one of the examples that you can quote in exam is the 2007 China's anti-satellite missile test. So when it tried to, for the first time, defunct its own satellite, destroy its own satellite, it led to creation of tons of debris over there, which started colliding with other satellites and destroying the missions of other countries. So therefore, it also creates another challenge, which is space debris. And then on social front and on economic front and on political front, it also enhances the space inequity. This is a very interesting concept. Now what is happening is, most of the space technological power or knowledge or innovation or research and development is done by some of the premier agencies of the world, which are basically owned by a handful of nations, just 5 to 6, India being one of them. Acha, is India part of a managing country of ISS, which is the International Space Agency? Try to ponder on it. You must be already having the answer of it. Try to answer it. So now, coming back to the main point, space inequity. So what happens is, because handful of countries are having those innovation and products, so obviously all the other parts of the country, all the other parts of the world, all the other countries would be looking up to these handful of countries, which means all the major countries of Middle East, Africa, South America, they will be looking to whom? They will be looking towards, let's say, NASA, or let's say Russia, or let's say China or India. This will lead to enhancing space inequity, because now this will enhance their reliance on them for technology transfer. So if these countries, like for example, most of the countries of Africa, there's an example of Nigeria SAT. So Nigeria has been partnering with Russia every time it wants to launch a vehicle or a satellite. So Nigeria SAT, all the versions of it were launched by Roscosmos only. But this, what it does is, It enhances the negotiating power of Russia, not of the Nigeria. It makes the Nigeria dependent on it. And also they are dependent on Russia now, not just technically but also financially. So it also enhances the dependence, especially of the poor nations. Then think about the small island developing nations. So what will happen to them? So the space inequity is also rising. Now, what could be the way forward and what India has been doing to enhance its space diplomacy? Let's have a look. So these are again important points which you shall need to incorporate. So the first case of India's space diplomacy would come in the form of NASA and ISRO collaboration to create something which we call synthetic aperture radars. Okay, so these radar inbuilt satellites which are there with radars, this will be created under the mission NISAR. So here India is cooperating with NASA. Okay, then India has been also collaborating with Japan on many missions, but the most important upcoming mission is, the most important collaboration between ISRO and Japan is the upcoming Chandrayaan 4 mission, which is also mission LUPEX. So this is also another collaboration. The next collaboration is among its neighboring countries. So we know that India has got a regional navigation satellite which is IRNSS, also named as NAVIC. Details about it we have already read in the previous months of Recital magazine, so you can refer them as well. Now NAVIC is going to extend its regional connectivity support and the vigilance, the monitoring activities, not just for the boundaries of India but also extended to the neighbors. So all the neighbors, the SAARC member countries will also be getting the NAVIC services. So India is enhancing its space diplomacy to its neighborhood. Now the fourth one is a collective satellite. This is named as GSAT-4. Now GSAT-4 is created by collaboration of the South Asian countries, and they will be using telecommunication collectively, e-governance collectively, and some other services, for example banking, with the help of GSAT-4. So basically what is GSAT-4? It is a common satellite for giving the services, the following services to the South Asian countries. So these are some of the India's space diplomacy endeavors. And then not to forget, in the previous one, we also have InSpace. We were reading about InSpace only, right? So what InSpace does? It provides more efficient and affordable solutions, space-based solutions against the collaborations. So it is also inviting for India's space diplomacy, a very important arm for strengthening the India's diplomacy in the space sector. So give the example of InSpace as well. And you can put the example of whom? Which example can be put over here where India is collaborating with other countries? Mission Maitri can be used as an example, the topic that we are reading. So collaboration with Australia can also be quoted with an example. Always remember, whenever you are writing a point in the mains answer, try to enhance it with the help of some relevant example, because it legitimizes your statement more as compared to the other people who are writing the same answer. Okay, because the generic pointer would anyway be the same. Now, as we were talking about the collaboration, mission LUPEX, or the collaboration between ISRO and JAXA, which is with the name of Chandrayaan 4, we'll be just very briefly reading the features of it. Chandrayaan 4 is going to be launched in 2027 as recently announced by Mr. Somnath, who is the director of ISRO. This is a mission type where only lander and rover will be deployed. Okay, and it will be carried by not one but multiple propulsion. So it is going to be a 2-stage or 2 launching vehicle mission, one of its kind in the world. So it will be carried by, so talking about the launching vehicle, it will be launched by H3 launching vehicle of JAXA, Japanese Space Agency, and also by the LVM-3, GSLV Mark III of India. So it will be utilizing multiple technologies across space missions. Then the mission is obviously under these 2 countries. So this is a international diplomacy, space diplomacy among these 2 countries. Mission duration would be 6 months. It will be exploring the South Pole region of the moon. Okay, and who will be developing what? JAXA would be developing lander and rover, and lander and its equipments and its attachments would be developed by ISRO primarily. Okay, launching vehicle would be collectively provided by both of them, and most importantly, as of now it is decided that it will be launched in the Tanegashima city of Japan and not in India. So these are some of the important features, very important for your prelims examination. So I thought I might as well put in over here. Now, as we were talking about the way forward to strengthen the space diplomacy across the world so that we can move towards more sustainable space practices or space utilization practices, the primary important is to have a holistic international law which has to be mandatorily signed by all the and to be complied by all the states which are trying to make an endeavor into space. Do we have any such laws? There are, but there are fragmented laws. This is one of the issues. We need a more comprehensive law. So one of the forerunners of creating this international space law was United Nations. United Nations in its committee to use the outer space for peaceful purposes under the UN COPUS mission created the international space law under multiple domains. These multiple domains or the treaties which came under or which came as an outcome of UN COPUS meetings were, first of all, the Moon Agreement, which is basically equitable distribution of the resources of Moon and information about the Moon and sustainable use of Moon. So there is Moon Agreement, there is Liability Convention. So if any mishap happens by any country in the space, if they damage any asteroid or any other mineral resource over there, who will be held liable? So the country who has taken up this particular destruction would directly be held liable in it. So basically, Liability Convention imposes the liability on the person who has or on the country who has committed this damage. Next is the Outer Space Treaty. We have already talked about it. It is all about how to manage the space resources and also how to use it peacefully. What it says is that there is a prohibition of the use of nuclear weapons. So even if you can use the missiles, but they should be of the name of anti-satellite and not just the name. The need of the hour is that they should be not just in letter but also in spirit, only used for peaceful purposes and not for weaponization of the space. This is Outer Space Treaty. Next is the Rescue Agreement, which means, let's say, any astronaut gets caught up in the space, then who will assume the responsibility of bringing them back? So there's a collaboration on it. So for example, Sunita Williams and the other space partner of hers is also stuck in the space right now, in the ISS, in the International Space Station. So under the Rescue Agreement, they have to be rescued mandatorily. Second is the Registration Convention as to under which norms and guidelines all these space vehicles or all the space products would be authorized. Next is similar one created under Asia Pacific Commission to regulate or to ensure the peaceful use of outer space. Please understand that though India is a part of UN COPUS, India is not a part of AP COPUS because it is primarily participated by China, countries like Iran, countries like Turkey. So India is not a part of it. India, USA are not part of Asia Pacific SCO. Okay, so this was all about space diplomacy. We have learnt about what is Space Med 3 mission, what is the importance of space diplomacy, what are the multiple components, what is NSIL, what is Antrix, what is the difference between NSIL in space. Then we have read about Chandrayaan 4 also. So in this one topic, we have tried to encompass as much as possible. Next one, so the next topic is AI washing. To understand AI washing, let me tell you a particular story. Let's say I am running a shop and I am about to run a business. So I purchased a bag. I purchased a very handy, a very beautiful bag of just 2,000 rupees. Now I want to sell it to my customers. Of course, I would make some scope for profit margin, but then I got to know that there is rising demand of Prada bags. So what I'll do, I will falsely brand my bag as a Prada bag. First of all, is it legal or illegal? It is illegal. But you must have seen it happening in many shops. And ultimately, because of the market demand, the overall price would go from 2,000 rupees to 2 lakh rupees. So what am I doing over here? This is a marketing technique by me. What I'm doing? This is a marketing technique in which I am trying to falsely brand or falsely promote a product to harness the current market demand. So this is something which we are going to read in AI washing also. When it comes to washing, you must have already heard about green washing, white washing, and AI washing. Let's try to understand both of them. What is green washing? Green washing is when a product is falsely branded as climate friendly or environmental friendly, eco-friendly or sustainable product. Why? Because there is rising demand of such green products. So I'm trying to harness the market demand, and then I'm falsely branding my product as a green product, that it is environmental friendly, while in reality it is not. An example for this is the Volkswagen company. So back in the days, Volkswagen, which is basically a car company, claimed that it is creating some of the cars which are not producing emissions, and these are the least emission producing cars in the market. But in the reality, what they did, they installed certain softwares in their car which could cheat the emission detection test. So therefore, they were also held liable by the federal court back then. So one example of this is Volkswagen. Okay. This is greenwashing. Something which is not eco-friendly, I'm just branding it, painting it to be green. That is completely eco-friendly. Similar thing is with AI washing. AI washing means that because there is a rising demand of things should be having AI in it, so to leverage that market demand, I'm painting everything as AI driven. So any product that I'm creating, I'm calling it as AI driven. This is known as AI washing. Basically, I'm falsely branding my product as having AI technology, even if it is having nil or very insignificant amount of AI use in it, which can be very much explained from this cartoon. So as you can see, this person is asking, have you figured out how AI will impact our business? So the person who's working in ChatGPT is telling that yes, because I'm deriving all our results and all the impacts that it could have from ChatGPT only, because ChatGPT is driven by AI, which means the entire company is driven by AI. This is one of the AI washing. Why do they do this? Because when they claim themselves to be green, when they claim themselves to be AI driven, then they try to ask more price or higher price for the same product to their customers. Okay. So why do we do that? Why AI washing is happening? First of all, because of rising demand of AI. Second is to attract the investors. So while they will market or while they will pitch in their proposal to the investor to get the money, they will market it as something which is heavily AI driven, heavily relevant for the current generation and very result oriented, very efficient product. But in the reality, when they'll be taking that money and creating the product, the end product would not be compliant with their promises. And eventually वो investor को बोलेंगे कि अरे हम तो भूल गए AI डालना, या बहुत ही basic चीजें they will tell that we have used some of the technologies in order to promote our businesses, etc. So first of all, why it happens is to attract the investor. Second is to attract the consumer. If a consumer knows that something is eco-friendly, we ought to buy it more, even at the cost of giving or basically taking it at higher prices. So it also attracts the consumers. That is the second thing. And the most structural issue in AI domain is that there is a vague definition of AI. When I talk about artificial intelligence, it is a technology which is able to mimic the cognitive functions of a human brain in efficient manner. Okay, cognitive functions of human brain would involve some of the basic calculations and some of the complex decision making. So there is a huge wide spectrum. Okay, what happens in the case of AI? Let's say if somebody promises you to perform a calculation of, like say, multiplication of 1,000-digit long unit with again 1,000-digit long unit and call it AI, then is it really an AI? No, because Google can also do it. Sometimes some advanced calculators can also do it. So there is no necessarily use of AI in it. But they will falsely brand it. Why? Because the definition of AI, especially in the business domain, is very, very vague. So they try to exploit that definition and try to take advantages of it. Second, what are the concerns? Now, the main concerns of AI washing is, can you predict? First of all, it breaks the trust of that company in the market. It also plays with the market sentiment, plays with the sentiment of the investors and consumers, and also exploits them financially and economically. So what are the concerns? First of all, it deceives the customer, because something which was just costing me, let's say just 2,000 rupees, is now costing me 20,000 rupees. Why? Because it has been falsely labeled and I have been pitched wrongfully for it, right? So it deceives the customer because they might have to pay costly prices for it. The cost price increases. Second is security and privacy risk. If something is AI driven, it must be requiring a lot of data, especially AI is used nowadays in a lot of pushed or promoted marketing. So in these cases, in the case of aggressive marketing, they try to pull out as much data as possible. So when you have been lured into a product which is AI driven, you might be lured into giving you a lot of data details also. And this could pose privacy risk. This could lead to data breaches. So this happened with a company, P-Checks. So P-Checks, it actually took up the entire data, the entire mobile security codes of the customers, in which it was basically a app, and when it got installed, it took up all the data of the customers, including their mobile pins, right? So these are some of the privacy risk. The next is complicative decision making. How does it complicate the decision making? Especially in the front of investors, because now the trust issues come into play. Now it becomes very difficult for them to decide whether they should really trust a particular product which is labeling itself as AI driven or not. Why? Because they know that there are many fraudulent cases in the market. So it complicates the process of trust building, complicates the process of decision making, further delaying the investment for the products which are genuinely AI driven. Okay. Next is, it is illegal. Why? Because under certain laws of Companies Act and other Products Act, the product disclosure, the process disclosure, the patent disclosure is a mandatory process in front of the investors. But if you are falsely labeling something for a marketing gimmick, of course you are doing something which is illegal and also outright unethical. So these are the concerns. So how to prevent it? Prevention comes from taking care of the structural issues. Main structural issues in case of any policy loophole lies in how do we define it. If there is vagueness in the definition, there is vagueness in lawmaking and then further compliance. So first of all, we need to have definition, and second, we need to collect hard evidences of AI. So how to collect the hard evidences? AI is driven by certain programming tools, certain software, certain hardwares are required, certain levels of servers are required. So are they really deployed or not? That processes should be checked first. So the hard evidences should be checked first as compared to just falling for the marketing gimmicks or the marketing proposals. So the second one is buy the processes and not the promises. And for this, another different kind of amendment should be made to the International Company and Corporate Laws. Second thing is product ethics compliance should be there. So there should be certain product ethics created for AI based products as well. And they should be based on equality ethics, the ethics of privacy, ethics of data privacy, data security, etc. Next is, we require global efforts for this, because all of the countries could have their different regulations in their own Companies Act, in their own corporations. But what do we need is a global centralized effort. So for that, the countries which are trading AI services from each other also does not suffer from this malpractices of AI washing. So I hope this concept is clear to you. So our next topic is about eco-friendly supercapacitors. Why are we reading it? Because very interestingly, Kerala University has decided that the agriculture waste, that is in the form of coconut husk, will now be utilized to create a very important component of the electronics industry, that is the capacitors, and not just the average capacitor, but supercapacitors. What are capacitors and what are their working principle? We'll understand, but first, have a look into this. What is this? This is a battery cell. And what is this? This is a mobile phone. What is the difference between both of them? Can this power a light bulb, or can this produce power? Or basically, can it produce charges? Yes, it can. Can this produce power? Yes, this can also produce the power. But at the same time, if it gets discharged, can it get charged again? In the case of a battery cell, it's a straight no. We know that when this dry cell dies out, it has to go for the garbage. On the other hand, if the battery of a mobile phone dries out, what do? We charge it because it has got the capacity of both charging and discharging capacity. This is available in almost all. Basically, this charging and discharging capacity is available in all the electronics components because they are powered by something which we call as capacitors. So what are capacitors? Capacitors, something which look like this, are the energy storage devices. They have the capability of storing charges in them and also discharging them in order to give light or in order to give power to something else. So this unique ability of capacitor makes it very useful in the electronics industry. And why is building supercapacitor important for India? Because we are about to become a $230 billion worth electronics industry by 2030. In order to harness that kind of market, we need to produce products to that extent. In order to create electronics product, the most fundamental thing that we would require is not just the silicon chip, but also capacitors, and especially supercapacitors because they are more efficient. Talking about the capacitor, let's now understand their working principle and how do they work. A typical structure of capacitor looks something like this. It is comprising of two electrodes. Electrodes means something which carry the charges, especially of opposite polarity, when they are given any kind of voltage. Okay, so these two electrodes which are at a distance, let's say d, this distance is filled by a dielectric. Dielectric is something which has the capability of carrying the ions but not transporting them. So basically it forbids the passage of current between it, and only in selective cases current would be passed. So here a capacitor means two electrodes filled with not a catalyst, like unlike a fuel cell, consisting of a dielectric, for example water. Water or H2 is also a dielectric substance. This is a capacitor. How does it work? Now, let's say in ordinary situation where it is applied with volt 0, it will first get charged before, let's say positive ions have been maintained over here and negative over here. The maintenance of ion is done by the dielectric. Okay, so here it is now charged. Okay, and if I switch on this voltage, if I provide a V amount of volt, then the passage of current will start and it will further cause for charging of this capacitor. It has the ability to store the charges. Please remember, it does not store or allows the flow of current, but it stores electrostatic charges. Okay, so what it stores? Electrostatic charges. How much electrostatic charges is stored is measured in the form of capacitance. So how much charge is stored in a particular capacitor is measured as the property is known as capacitance. So higher the capacitance, the more efficient it is. So therefore, when I'm saying something is supercapacitor, it has supercapacitance, which means a higher density to take up or to accumulate all the charges in it. Now, this is the charging phase where it is accumulating the charges, storing the charge in it. It is getting charged. In the second phase, let's say if in the place of a battery, I put up a bulb over here. In that case, again, the current will start flowing and eventually it will get discharged by fueling the power of this bulb. So this is the process of discharging. So because it can do both the charging and discharging, therefore it is very useful in many things. For example, your mobile phones, it can shut off, it can switch on very easily. For example, taking the cameras, the power burst which is required in order to produce flash when you turn on the camera, that is made possible because of supercapacitors only. What is the difference between capacitor and supercapacitor? A capacitor has lower capacitance, ability to store the charges compared to supercapacitor. Supercapacitors are also having longer lifespan. Average or conventional capacitors would die out very soon. Of course, they will have more longer lifespan as compared to the fuel cells or to the traditional cells that I have just shown to you. But at the same time, it is lesser as compared to supercapacitors. Okay, the discharging and charging time is also higher in the case of supercapacitors. So therefore, in order to build a robust electronics industry, what is very much required? It is supercapacitors. Okay, Now, talking about electronics industry, electronics are everywhere around us. Electronics are there in consumer durables, in automotives, in grid energy storage. The supercapacitors therefore have got applications in all the domains wherever electronics can be used, even if something is not given over here. For example, space domain, energy efficiency domain, power grids, all of those are also using supercapacitors. So supercapacitors are used in automotives to build the hybrid vehicles or the e-vehicles. Okay, to build consumer electronics, for example, cameras, mobile, gadget, tab, laptop, etc. Everything that has the ability to shut down and shut off very quickly has definitely got capacitors in it. Next is the grid energy storage, because this has got a very high ability of storing the charge in a very small space, because the density, the charge density per unit volume is very high in case of supercapacitors. So it can also store large amount of energy, and this will lead to lower amount of power outages, and therefore the batteries, the backup batteries that we use have got capacitors in them. Okay. Now, when India made this innovation of creating the coconut husk, how was it actually possible? The electrodes that we were talking about, they can actually be made up of graphene. They can be made up of activated carbon. And can we not create them from agricultural produce? So the agriculture residue, the agriculture waste, which could again be an environmental menace, which could lead to production of effluents and some of the polluting gases. Now that can be used in helping our electronics industry. So this is a very beautiful innovation. Now talking about how this eco-friendly supercapacitor will be giving us multiple benefits. First of all, because it is getting produced from something as basic as biomass, it can be very readily produced, very easily produced. So production of eco-friendly capacitors becomes very easy. We can produce it in economies of scale and masses. Second is, it is environmental friendly. How? First of all, to make anything environmental friendly, we have to ensure that when we are decomposing them, when they run out of their life, they should not be a trouble for the environment. In the case of supercapacitor, if they are made up of artificial electrode or artificial dielectric material that I have shown you, of course they will be posing some of the toxins in the environment, right? So this, because in this case the electrodes are made up of biomass and the dielectric is essentially consisting of water. So when I will decompose it, will it be toxin? No. So it is first of all non-toxic. Second, because it is comprising of everything which is very much degradable, so therefore it is also biodegradable. And also, it is much more energy efficient, because the energy required to produce this capacitor and the amount of energy which will eventually be stored and generated by the capacitor would be very high. So the cost benefit ratio would be very good in this case. So it is also going to be an energy efficient option, right? So this is not only a biodegradable, environmental friendly, non-toxic, but also energy efficient, this which makes it environmental friendly. Now, next topic. Imagine a star exploding so brightly that you could actually see it through naked eyes. This is going to happen soon, because a star which is located in the north crown of the Earth's constellation, named as Coronia Borealis, is going to undergo a nova explosion. Let me make it clear that among all the different processes of the dying out of the star, nova explosion precedes the supernova explosion. So this is not supernova. What is the difference? We'll be exploring, but first of all, let's understand where to look for the star. So as the name suggests, this is Borealis. Anything which has the name Borealis, we have already heard about Aurora Borealis. Why? Because it is in the somewhere where the boreal forests are also there, which is basically towards the poles, especially towards the northern pole. So anything which is in the northern pole, northern hemisphere, is named as Borealis. So naturally, it is located somewhere over here. See, this is the northern hemisphere. This is the northern hemisphere, and it is located in this constellation, in the constellation of Coronae Borealis, and this is the specific location. Location is not very important. This is just out of curiosity I tried to answer it. So this is Coronae Borealis, which is going to have nova explosion. This is the concept. Here we will going to discuss a very important concept of the birth of the star and what leads to the dying of it and all the processes involved in the same. So in the primordial universe, there existed no stars but giant clouds of gases and dust. because it had some kind of matter in it, this also started having gravity. Because of the pull of gravity, all the materials started getting conglomerated between the cloud. Because of this conglomeration, the gravity furthered up, which means the gravity increased in that cloud system. So first of all, when we talk about stellar nucleosynthesis, how and what led to the formation of nucleus of the stellar or the star, that is the nebula, a cloud which existed. Now, because of the gravitational pull, it started spinning and further coagulation of the denser particles started happening in the core. As a result of this, the energy of the core increased. Because of the increased energy, it could now create fusion between two atoms, especially between the fusion of hydrogen atoms. And because of the fusion reaction, now we could see that helium atoms got concentrated into the core. And this led to the creation of protostar, because what happens? When a fusion reaction happens, it leads to 5 million times more energy as compared to a nuclear fission reaction, because huge amount of energy was getting produced, something very gigantic, very enormous and emitting a lot of energy got created in the name of protostar, because it was still in its nascent stage. As this energy was growing, more and more hydrogen atoms were fusing into helium and more amount of energy was getting released. So now finally, it led to creation of main sequence star. This is the most stable form of the star. The sun that you see right now is under its main sequence phase. Why? Because what happens in star? Two kind of forces are acting. If these two forces are balanced, the shape, size and mass of the star will be maintained and the star will be stabilized for a longer period of time. But if these two forces, which I am going to tell you, if they disrupt themselves or if there is any disbalance between both of them, then what will happen? The star will either collapse or the star will either grow like anything. So these two forces, first of all, is gravity. Gravity, which is trying to pull everything inside the center of the star. Because that is the nature of gravity, it will pull everything towards the center of mass. Center of mass is the core. But at the same time, because of the fusion reaction, there is outward radiations which are pushing the star in outward direction. Because of this balance achieved between inward and outward forces, we reach a point of equilibrium where the size and shape of star is maintained. This star is known as main sequence star. Okay, so now we have reached the main sequence star. Why? Because energies are balanced. Now, as I've already told you, what happens if this energy starts getting disbalanced? Then the star will start to explode. Depending upon the type of star, there are various kinds of stars. There could be a white dwarf, yellow dwarf like that of our sun. There could be a red giant. There could be massive stars as well. They go through different fates because of their own shapes and sizes. But the leading cause is the disbalance of the force, which leads to their collapse. So what happens if, let's say, the mass of the star starts getting decreased? Now it is not having enough hydrogen to fuse into fuel, which is helium. If it is not able to fuse, then what will happen? That this core will become more stronger. And as a result, the core will become very heated up. So much heated that all the elements around it will start getting radiated. Radiated means, just imagine that you put a pan and in that pan you put some oil. If your flame is so high that it will eventually make the oil to reach its ignition temperature, that pan will explode. So similar explosion happens. Why? Because of high concentration at the core. High concentration at the core means more amount of heat energy in the core, and this will explode all the other ions. This will lead to enormous explosion and seemingly it seems like a red giant, something which is increasing its size in space. If the fuel gets further decreased and further consolidation of core happens, more heat will accumulate. More heat means that now all these atoms will now get ionized in the form of vapors. And only a small core will be left. So these vapors will again appear in the form of a very bright star, but it is actually not a bright star, it's a bright cloud as a result of nova explosion. Because this star is not a very big star. That Coronae Borealis that we were reading, it's not a very big star. It will only undergo the nova explosion and not the supernova explosion. Okay, so nova explosion happened. Why? Because cloud of vapors are again getting created. This is ionized gases which are getting created, disassociated from the main star. Okay, this is the nova explosion, and why it seems like a very bright star or something of a very gigantic light has suddenly appeared. Okay, so now we have understood till here. We have understood till here how average star forms into red giant first and then planetary nebula, how a massive star first forms into red supergiant and then supernova. So it all depends upon the mass of the star. Okay, and which among these stars, does all stars become black hole? Please tell me, does all stars become the black hole? No. It again depends upon their mass, which we are going to read. So we have already read about red giant formation. Why it happens? Because hydrogen fuel is exhausted, so core is heavily heated. Okay, supernova explosion happens because the entire fuel is completely exhausted. Then formation of neutron star or black hole. How does that happen, and in which condition it happens? So first of all, the categories of star that we should read. First is white dwarf. White dwarf, sun also comes under white dwarf, which means having mass equivalent to our sun, 1 solar mass. Second is stars which are having more than 1.4 times of solar mass to 3 solar mass. So 1.4 to 3 solar masses stars will have the fate of becoming neutron star or go nova explosion. And our sun, what will be its fate? Will it become black hole or neutron star? No, it will just become a white dwarf. And who will become a black hole? Having masses exceeding 3 solar masses. Those stars will become black hole, and this limit is known as Tolman-Oppenheimer-Volkoff limit. Interestingly, what is going to be the fate of black hole? We know that black hole, when formed, is actually nothing but a point of singularity getting formed with extremely high gravitational pull, so much so that it also distorts the time fabric of the entire solar system around it or the universe around it. So singularity formation will happen, which means black hole has formed. Now, according to the Stephen Hawking's evaporation hypothesis, this is already a theory, it is not in practical, not yet established. Black hole theory evaporation says that certain radiations will still be emanating out of the black hole, and in across huge and a long eternity, this black hole will also die out. Why? Because radiations will be emerged out of it, the gravitational pull will be collapsed, and this black hole will also evacuate. Now, next topic is 3D hologram technique. So what is the context? Japanese government have decided that their currency yen is now going to be embellished with a holograph. As you can see, this holograph. So what is a hologram? What is holographic technology? What concepts of light does it use? We are going to look into in this discussion. So first of all, a hologram is something which contains patterns of light embellished together. Now these patterns of light are captured and reconstructed in the form of an art with the help of hologram technique or holographic technique, which utilizes two optical theories. The first theory, the first principle is the principle of optical interference, and the second one is diffraction. So what happens if, let's say, through a light bulb, two light rays are coming. If from a same source, two different lights are coming, then what will happen? From the same source, two lights are coming. Eventually, they will start interacting with each other. Because they are interacting with each other, they will lead to creation of interference patterns. This is known as light interference. Okay, then what is light diffraction? Light diffraction is that when a light, when it hits any tiny obstacle, mind you, it should be a very tiny sharp-edged obstacle. In that case, it spreads out, and both of them corresponds to the wave theory of light, not the particle nature of light. So here, diffraction and optical interference, when both of them take place together, then it leads to creation of hologram. During your physics experiments, you must have already undergone single slit or double slit experiments. So they showcases both these principles together. So you basically allow a light to pass through a slab which is having two very small sharp-edged slits. the light will get polarized and it will also form a lot of interference patterns. And as a result, at some points you can see high intensity of light, and at some points you will see dark bands. So there will be light bands and there will be dark bands alternatively arranged. Why? Because of diffraction and interference. Interference leads to light reaching peak at some points and dips at some points. So where it is reaching peak, there will be light bands, and where is it reaching dips, there will be dark bands or no light. Okay, so this is the technique used by hologram technology. This is how a typical hologram looks. Can you see that a lot of light bands, light patterns are actually constructed and converged together, packed together. So this gives us a 3D image. Therefore, it has got multiple applications in order to secure any art form, in order to provide encoding, security codes, because holograms cannot be copied. Therefore, in your books like H.C. Verma, the important established Lakshmikant book, there is holograms. Why? Because they cannot be copied. They can only be created from the original source. Okay. So now, what is this technology? The technology is of recording lights and then reconstructing using optical or computational methods. On the basis of which method are we using? This technology will be divided into digital your holography or optical holography. Optical holography is more conventional method, digital holography is more modern method. But anyway, what are we doing? We are recording light. So let's say there is a cube. There is a cube. Now I'm hitting it with light from all the directions. I'm hitting it with light through all the direction. This will give me multiple sizes of cubes, multiple appearances of cube. Now I will integrate all these images into one photo with the help of computational techniques. And now it will give me a 3D image. This is a hologram. Okay. So the interference and the holographic technique can also be derived from nature. So as you can see that these clouds, when sunlight reaches them, their sharp edges diffract the light, and therefore the light becomes more spreaded out, more brighter as compared to how it was really before reaching the clouds. This is the process of diffraction. This is also the process of interference. Also, can you see that this hologram is nothing but a derivative of what we learn from nature? So whenever a rain droplet or whenever oil or petroleum gets mixed with rain droplet, it produces something like this in the ground. Why it does this? Because of diffraction. Okay, the same condition is put in application in holographic technique. Now, while this topic is not very important for UPSC, we will be just very quickly reviewing the application. So application is anywhere where we would require to create certain synthetic image. So for example, in education sector, you would like to have some hands-on model, the double slit experiment. You would like to have sandboxing of certain projects. So for that, for creating those projects, holography can be used. Again, because it is creating light, it is creating image. So it can also be used in medicine to create or to simulate some of the surgeries or some of the medicines and the diagnostics and treatments. Next is entertainment. It can also give a very enriching and immersive 3D experience also, because we are just creating a 3D image, right? Now, very quickly differentiating between what is optical and what is digital holography. There's no much difference, just understand these two words. First of all, who records the light in an optical hologram? It is the laser beam which is hit into the object from multiple angles. In the case of computer, it is captured digitally by a camera. Okay. In the case of reconstruction, this is illuminated with a reference beam, again with the help of a light, because this is optical. Now the reconstruction is done using algorithm and not just light, so it is more easily manipulatable. So this is more easy to be manipulated. Okay, which one? The digital hologram. Then what are the advantages, limitations, applications? These are not very important. Just understand the basic differences between hologram technique, their application, and what is the principle behind it. Now, if God has made anything in the world, can it be referred as junk at all? Not at all. So recently it has been found that transposons, which are also known as the selfish DNAs or the junk DNAs, are also having good amount of application in gene editing. So even if you feel that something is not worthwhile or something is not having or holding good meaning, it might hold meaning if you change the perspective towards it. So taking it from there. So what are transposons? Transposons are the genes or a part of genes which are contained inside genome. What are genome? Genomes are those which consist of the entire genetic code or genetic information of an organism. So transposons, first of all, are not RNA but DNA sequences. We are having multiple DNA sequences, A, T, C, G, etc. in our body. And it is these arrangement which eventually determines whether how are we going to look like, what is going to be our immunity, what are going to be our threats, etc. So the transposons, their nature is that they are mobile genes. So they can cut, copy and paste themselves into certain area. That is the nature of transposon. So therefore, they are also known as mobile genes or junk genes. Why are they junk genes? Because they are not of much use inside the genetic information. They definitely create the mutation, but they themselves do not cause any harm or any kind of benefit to the organism or to the DNA or to the genome. Second is they are also known as selfish genes, because they have the capacity to copy themselves only. They are uninteractive with the other DNA, with the other molecular cells. They only interact with themselves. They only copy themselves again and again. Okay, and they are also able to move, so they can move from point A to point X in our genome system. Okay, so therefore they are also known as jumping genes. So basically, if I just brief it up, it's simply a piece of DNA that can move from one location to another in a cell's genome. Now, who was the one who got Nobel Prize for discovering it? It was first of all discovered in a maize crop, and it was discovered by Barbara McClintock. Okay, and so she got the Nobel Prize for it as well. They were also initially known as disassociators because they were not really engaging or associating with the genes, with the other genes. Okay, now they are most abundant in eukaryotic genomes than prokaryotes. What is the difference between eukaryote and prokaryote? Something which I have already taught, so I will not be repeating it. It is very basic general science, but you should be knowing it. Now, how does it look like and what are the processes performed by it? So let's say this is a part of our genome, this is a part of our DNA. Now, another part of DNA would be this transposon. Now, can you see that this transposon, it moves and then it gets located into this DNA, this part of the DNA. So basically it is interrupting our DNA sequence or not. This will lead to mutation or not. This will lead to creation of new characteristic or not. Yes, though not very significant characteristic, but in prokaryotes, especially in microorganism, they are able to mutate to a great extent. Anyway, how has it done it? Because it has cut itself from here and ultimately pasted it to another location. Another thing which it can do is copy pasting. In copy pasting, it has remained itself over here, created a copy in the targeted site and got into the targeted site as well. Okay, this is basic of transposon, the two applications, the two methods of transposition of them. Now, transposons are also of two types. Very quickly summarizing it. First is retrotransposon. So what they do, they just follow the copy pasting mechanism. Copy pasting mechanism means that they are DNA sequence. How will they copy paste? How will they create another DNA copy? Can DNA be directly created into DNA? No. DNA first gets converted into RNA. What is this process called? In the comment section. So DNA gets converted into RNA, then it again gets converted into DNA with the help of an enzyme. Can it happen naturally? No. So it requires a kind of enzyme for it to facilitate the reaction. That enzyme is known as reverse transcriptase. Okay. The second class is the DNA transposons. So DNA transposons just cut and paste themselves. So they do not need to create another DNA copy. Okay. They just need to cut themselves with the help of an enzyme. This cutting is done with the help of an enzyme which is known as transposase. So in the gene editing technique, cannot we use this cutting enzyme? Cannot we take lessons from this cutting enzyme and create some of the biomolecular scissors? So this is how it has become very important in the biotechnology, in genetic engineering, and of course in gene editing. Now, what are the applications? Applications is first of all in the evolutionary role, because it can play up with the space of or the place of the gene. So which means it can help us in adaptation. They can help us in creating new combination of the genes, right? So they will also play a very good role in understanding how the inheritance and how the evolution happened. So evolutionary research can be augmented with the help of this transposon. Second is gene regulation. In order to deal with any disease, any complex medication, gene regulation can also be performed because they can very much provide mutations within the gene. Why? Because they have the ability of carrying themselves to a targeted site by themselves. Okay, so it can also be used in gene regulation wherever it is required. Let's say in the cancer patient, let's say in some of the patients where hereditary diseases are getting transferred, for example, hemophilia. Okay, next is it can be used as a genetic engineering tool. I have already told you the transposase enzyme, they can be used as a biomolecular scissor, and they can also be used by the medical scientist in order to understand how to pick a particular gene and to place it at the targeted site without any mishap or any error. These are some of the applications, very basic ones. And now coming to the next topic, this is Exome 4. So what is Exome 4 first of all? Exome 4 is actually conducted by Exome Space. Exome Space is a private company. It is not a premier government organization. It is a private space company which is created or working in collaboration with NASA and SpaceX. So Exome is going to launch its fourth project of space flight mission. What is unique about it? Not that it is space flight, but it is private led space flight mission, which is the company Exome, led by NASA and SpaceX. Okay, so this is the private space flight mission to where International Space Station, because what happens, International Space Station is a permanent and regularly working live space science laboratory. When I'm saying it is permanently based, which means ever since its inception in 1999, ever since that when the first mission happened, so from basically right after 2000, humans have been there researching in the astroscience labs of ISS. So there is no absence of humans over there. There is a continuous presence, and therefore it is known as a permanent laboratory. So now private missions are also making endeavor to put some humans there with the help of their own launching vehicles. Now, why are we reading about this? Why is it important to us? Because ISRO has called out, because ISRO has confirmed 2 of the Gaganyatris, the trained Gaganyatris, to be also a part of this Exome 4. Okay. The spacecraft which is going to be used in life mission 14 days, all of it is fine, but the important thing is that this is going to be the first non-Indian mission where Indian astronauts will be trained by NASA and they will be moving to ISS with the help of a private spaceflight mission. Okay, talking about the Gaganyaan mission is India's first targeted human space flight mission to the International Space Station, basically to the low Earth orbit, and this is going to be, they're going to stay there for 5 to 7 days. This is not an entirely human based mission. It has actually got multiple stages. In the initial 2 phases, non-human missions will be there, sending off Vyom Mitra, which is a bot, that will be done, and in the 3rd stage only, after assuring all the safety measures, our Gaganyatris would be sent. This is in collaboration with Roscosmos because they have trained the Gaganyatris. So talking about this mission, it will be carried by whom? It will be carried by PSLV, SSLV or GSLV. Even though the most reliable rocket is PSLV, the most heavy lifter is GSLV. So here in this case, GSLV M3 is going to lift the Gaganyatris there. Okay, there are going to be multiple phases, but of course it is comprising of 2 modules. One is the orbiter module and the second one is crew module. Crew module naturally consisting of the crews, and the second one is service module, which is going to do the in-orbit servicing of the crew members. Okay, and they will be in the deboosting phases. They will be safely aborted to the surface of the Earth near the Arabian Sea. At the coast of Gujarat. So basically they are going to pick it from Sriharikota and finally land it to Gujarat with a space endeavour at low Earth orbit of about 5 to 7 days.